Thanks, Eli. I was honored when Bud McFarlane called me from Africa and asked if I could stand in for him this morning, but to tell you the truth, since I spent 22 years as a Washington lawyer, and then I spent some time out at the CIA in the Clinton administration, I'm actually honored to be invited into any polite company for any purpose at all. People sometimes ask me why I kept leaving a perfectly fine law practice to go into the government a bunch of times, 5 times. And the answer is really very straightforward. Many of you here work for the government or have, and you know why you work for the government. You work for the government because of the public appreciation, right? I had a pretty good case example of that. I'd been at the CIA about 8 months. My wife and I were classmates in college in California. We decided we were going to fly out to a class reunion, cash in some old frequent flyer miles, see some old friends for 2 or 3 days, go to the homecoming game, take a few days off. Well, first thing that happened is my head of security at the CIA said, actually, Mr. Director, we want Mrs. Woolsey to go on a different plane because we don't want anyone named Woolsey on the plane. And I said, but wait, my name's Woolsey. And they said, oh, no, sir, you need to fly an alias. And of course, my first thought was, uh-oh, there go the frequent flyer miles. So my 2 security men and I go out to Dulles, and as we get on the plane, they stop by the cockpit and show the pilot and chief flight attendant that they're carrying weapons that they're authorized to by the federal government. We go back to the back row of coach, the 3 seats right in front of the bulkhead where you can't even lean back, and I'm sort of wedged between these 2 big guys for the 4.5-hour flight to California. As we get off the plane, walking down the jetway, flight attendant comes over and whispers something to one of them, and he just cracks up. And since he was a sort of a big, stolid guy, I was sort of surprised. So I said, Murph, what's so funny? He said, you know what she just said? She said, you know, I've been on these flights for 20 years, and that's the politest and best behaved prisoner that we have ever had. So, like I say, that's why we do government, right? It's the public appreciation. And that's right. Well, I was thinking about what it used to be like to deal with nuclear weapons and strategic decisions about the weight of offense and defense, deterrence, arms control, and the like. I was either an advisor, a delegate, or ambassador and chief negotiator in 4 different sets of arms control negotiations with the Soviets, and in one case the Soviets and their Warsaw Pact allies, over a little over a 20-year period. And when things would really get tight with the Soviets, difficult, like '83, it was a very difficult time because of the KAL shoot-down and tensions in the Cold War. And there was no progress at the negotiating table, in, say, in Geneva. Things might even got a little hot. I'd go to my Soviet counterpart sometimes and say, Oleg, what are your plans for dinner? You want to get a bite? He'd say, yeah, all right. So we'd go to a nice restaurant in Geneva, and on the American taxpayer, I'd buy him, I know he liked lobster thermidor, a nice bottle of Chablis. Evening would go on, we'd start talking about our families, tell jokes, you know, Russian and American senses of humor are really rather similar, sense of irony and self-deprecation. We, by the end of the evening, things were relaxed, and I could say something like, you know, like, we're not going to be able to help you out on what you were talking about today, but there's something else I know you're concerned about, this other subject, and I might have a little give on that, probably not now, but in a few weeks, but I'm going to expect you to give me a little something on this. All right, Jim, we'll think about it. That's a good idea. We'll study that. That used to be part of the way we dealt with strategic weapons. We had a strategy for dealing with the Soviets in the Cold War, deterrence and containment. It was set out by Kennan and by Nitze in NSC 68. And it was a good strategy. It didn't work quite as fast as we would have hoped. It took 45 years, but it worked pretty much the way Kennan and Nitze thought it would in the late 1940s. We contained the Soviets, we deterred them, and by pretty early in the Cold War, I'd say by the mid-50s, by the time of Khrushchev's 20th Party Congress speech about Stalin's crimes, their ideology was, for all practical purposes, dead. It was not entirely dead in places like Cambodia and Cuba, but in the Kremlin, there were probably more true believing communists in the bookstores of the Upper West Side of Manhattan than there were in the Kremlin by the mid to late 1950s. My negotiating counterparts in all these arms control talks, they didn't want to die for the principle of from each according to his ability to each according to his need. They wanted to keep their dachas. They wanted to make sure they could still shop at the dollar store that the KGB ran with goods that it brought in from Finland. Their ideology was dead for all practical purposes. And their system was thoroughly inefficient. We outweighted them, we contained them, we deterred them, and eventually their awful system collapsed. But during the course of those years, we had a lot of internal disagreement among ourselves about which way to go with respect to our own nuclear forces. Should we emphasize solely counterforce capability and not worry that much about survivability with, let's say, MXs stuck in silos? Or should we focus on the importance of being able to retaliate with a second strike and make even a missile as large as the MX effectively survivable by putting it in shelters, by moving it around in different ways? And what was the role of defense? Were we in the business of defense principally in order to take away, as seemed to be the case late in the Johnson administration, in order to take away part of the Soviets' throw weight advantage and their ability to target our own forces in a first strike? Were we principally in the business of defending the National Command Authority in Washington and the ballistic missile silos in North Dakota? Or could we think about a more national defense, one that would protect population in the event there was a breakdown in deterrence and an exchange of nuclear fire? The latter view came to more or less be adopted by the Reagan administration with the SDI program. And there are many who believe, and I think with some justification, that with the history of our moon landing behind us, and with their extraordinary respect for American technology, the Soviets thought we were much, much further along with respect to SDI than in fact we were, and that it may have been one of the things that so rattled them, along with, of course, their loss in Afghanistan and the unsettled nature of their governance domination of Eastern Europe, particularly with Solidarity and being active in Poland. But SDI may well have been one of the things that helped bring them down, even though it was still really only an R&D program. Full stop. We are not in Kansas anymore. If anybody here could imagine himself or herself or me or anyone sitting down in Geneva with a representative of, let's say, the Hojatiya, the circle around Ahmadinejad, headed by Ayatollah Mezbayazdi in the city of Qum, and having a lobster thermidor and a nice glass of Chablis and talking casually about how we can give a little bit on this if you can give a little bit on that, I think you would, if you even entertained for a moment such a thought, you would rather rapidly start smiling at the absurdity of it.